instantly claims central territory and prepares development, opening diagonal lines for queen and bishop. Instantly challenging the center, black prepares to contest central squares while developing a key piece towards the kingside, hinting at a dynamic game. F3 now prepares to castle kingside, while indirectly challenging black's knight on F6 for central influence. Solidifying the center, this move prepares to challenge white's pawn with its own d-pawn, aiming for a balanced positional game. Asserting central dominion, this pawn push contests space and prepares to develop the bishop to a more active diagonal. Disrupting white's pawn structure with a timely bishop check forces concessions and aims to equalize development. By offering the bishop, white forces a decision and aims for a comfortable development, potentially creating isolated pawn structures later. This repositioning of the queen, while seemingly passive, aims to connect the rooks and solidify central control. Developing the knight to c3 continues white's natural piece play, reinforcing the center and preparing for castling while maintaining flexibility. Preparing to fianchetto, the bishop offers a different dimension for piece development. Solidifying the center and preparing for castling, this allows black to continue their queenside expansion while white prioritizes king safety and central presence. The pawn advance curbs any immediate kingside ambitions and reinforces the central pawn chain, though it slightly restricts the dark-squared bishop's scope for the moment. Sacrificing tempo and piece activity for structural clarity, black immediately resolves the pin, but surrenders the bishop pair and allows white's center pawns to advance unchallenged. Reclaiming the pawn with the bishop opens lines for your own pieces, particularly the queen, and also begins the process of coordinating your forces on the queen side, setting the stage for potential king-side pressure later if black falters in development. Introducing a knight to e4 injects immediate dynamism, challenging the bishop on d2 and aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure. This audacious placement creates immediate tactical possibilities and forces white to consider the implications of its presence in the center. Positioning the rook on the c-file directly contests black's queen's only decent square and simultaneously prepares for potential central breakthroughs, hinting at a long-term pressure game along that open file. Repositioning the bishop to b7 aims to bolster the queenside pawn structure and potentially create an outpost for the knight on e4, while also preparing for potential pawn pushes down the center. This development prepares to castle queenside and activates the bishop onto a more open diagonal, aiming to contest the central control while simultaneously preparing for a potential kingside attack by clearing the way for the rook. Securing the monarch initiates a crucial phase of consolidation, preparing the king for potential skirmishes and allowing latent pieces on the kingside to begin their integration into the unfolding strategic battle. Safeguarding the monarch amidst the burgeoning central pawns solidifies the kingside, preparing for potential pawn storms or tactical skirmishes that might arise from the opponent's pieces now clustered around the center. Solidifying the center is key now, preparing to develop the bishop to a more active diagonal and potentially challenge white's control over the e4 square. A strategic repositioning, the knight abandons the active square to brace for an eventual advance into the center or potential support on the queen side, solidifying the pawn structure while preparing for a more fluid development. Sacrificing the bishop pair for a cleaner pawn structure and potentially opening lines to the king later is a bold positional choice, though it does concede a slight space advantage for now. Reclaiming the open c-file with the rook injects immediate pressure, targeting black's pawn structure and potentially creating mating nets around the undeveloped kingside. Initiating a pawn confrontation on the queenside with c5 opens up lines and challenges white's central influence, a sharp decision to fight for space and potentially disrupt white's harmonious development before it solidifies further. Disrupting black's centralized knight opens lines and creates a doubled pawn, a potential weakness, but also grants white a central pawn majority and control over the now open d-file. Embracing the opportunity, black liberates the queenside pawns, opening a diagonal for the light-squared bishop and establishing a more solid pawn structure, albeit with a slight concession in pawn majority. A direct challenge emerges, aiming to pierce the castled kingside, exploiting the newly opened queen's diagonal for a potential mating attack. Dislodging that aggressive queen becomes paramount, potentially creating downstream weaknesses. Unleashing a pawn storm toward the enemy king, white initiates an aggressive pawn thrust to shatter black's central pawn structure, opening diagonals and files for an onslaught, aiming to exploit any weaknesses in the monarch's protection. The knight finds a more active post, eyeing the d6 pawn and potentially preparing a sortie through f6, aiming to disrupt white's kingside initiative. Unlocking the center's potential, this move prepares for a pawn storm against the vulnerable black king. Unlocking the central complexities, 16e5 challenges the established pawn structure head-on, seeking dynamic counterplay amidst the closed lines. This bold thrust aims to shatter white's queenside pawn majority and create immediate tactical opportunities, potentially exposing the e4 pawn and drawing the knight away from its defensive post. It's a pivotal moment where black actively seeks to disrupt white's apparent positional dominance and inject a dose of sharp, forcing play into the game. Pivoting the knight to f3 strategically opens the f-file for potential future action and aims to reposition the piece towards the queenside, potentially reinforcing the e4 pawn or eyeing other squares. The knight's journey from d2 to f3 isn't merely a relocation, it's a subtle shift in white's ambitions. While it avoids the pin on d2 and clears the way for the d1 rook, it also signals a proactive stance, preparing for further pawn advances or creating more active squares for the knight itself. Consider the implications for the central tension and how this repositioning might influence the subsequent skirmishes on the queen side. It's a move that invites black to react to a changing landscape. Prying open the e-file is the immediate objective, aiming to unsettle white's central pawn mass and potentially create weaknesses around their castled king by utilizing the open column for rook activity. Sensing an opportunity on the kingside, white initiates a calculated knight sortie, aiming to reposition its rider into a more aggressive square and potentially initiate an attack against black's castled king. The maneuver, while seemingly direct, opens up avenues for future pawn pushes and centralizes the knight for potential sacrifices or discoveries. It's a strategic gamble that hinges on black's ability to adequately defend their monarch. Opening up lines with x4 immediately creates a dynamic imbalance, sacrificing pawn structure for potential piece activity, especially targeting that exposed white king. Reclaiming the rook on the open file, white aims to activate this piece as quickly as possible and exploit the weakened dark squares around black's king, potentially setting up a devastating battery on the g-file if black isn't careful. Black bravely challenges the initiative, forcing a reckoning for white's aggressively advanced knight and aiming to pry open lines for their own pieces. Reclaiming the initiative, this queen repositioning aims to exploit the slightly loose dark squares around black's king. The pawn structure on the kingside is now less of a fortress, and the possibility of a d5 pawn push by white could open lines. Shifting the knight to this square initiates a fascinating tactical dance, potentially targeting the weak squares around white's castled king, while simultaneously reinforcing the central pawn structure. The knight's new position creates intriguing attacking possibilities, hinting at a deeper strategic plan beyond immediate material gain. Refocusing the queen to the second rank aims to secure the pawn on e4 and prepare for potential pawn pushes on the kingside, subtly shifting the battleground. The knight's journey to d3, ending in a capture, seems to be a desperate attempt to disrupt white's central structure and free up black's pieces. However, it potentially gifts white an open file and a strengthened pawn center. By eliminating the knight, white gains control of the d3 square, a crucial outpost. The subsequent exchange might also expose black's king to increased pressure along the newly opened lines. Reclaiming the e-file, white aims to disrupt black's nascent central pawn structure and potentially create immediate threats against the black king, now that its primary defenders, the knights, have been exchanged off. This maneuver initiates a fascinating dynamic, as white's rooks, once awkwardly positioned on the back rank, now threat to become active participants in the middle game battle. Observe how the rook on d3 now eyes the c3 pawn, a key piece that was instrumental in black's recent pawn structure advancements. This shift in white's rook positioning could drastically alter the fight for control of open and semi-open files, potentially dictating the course of the ensuing exchanges. Suddenly, the queenside pawns are no longer a secure shield for the black king, and this knight's venture to the 7th rank opens up a surprising tactical possibility involving discovered attacks and potential material gain on the queenside, forcing white to carefully consider the consequences of this aggressive infiltration. Initiating a decisive pawn exchange on the open e-file, this recapture dramatically reconfigures the central landscape, aiming to exploit the exposed black monarch and potentially pry open critical lines for white's remaining pieces. Reclaiming the bishop's influence in the center creates a crucial defensive nexus, simultaneously bolstering the king's safety while preparing for potential counterplay on the open files. Reasserting central control with the rook now opens up possibilities for a more active presence on the 3rd rank, potentially targeting black's compromised pawn structure and preparing for future advances. Unleashing the pawn chain's latent energy, this thrust aims to shatter the central stronghold and open critical diagonal pathways for the queen and bishop. Securing the king's perimeter with this pawn advance feels like a calculated gesture, subtly preparing for potential defensive maneuvers, or perhaps even initiating a slow march forward once the immediate skirmishes subside. The rook immediately establishes its presence on the d-file, challenging white's doubled rooks and preparing to contest the open file, a crucial battleground for the upcoming middle game. Securing the queenside and preparing a potential expansion with b4 presents a solid positional choice, aiming to prevent black from exploiting weaknesses on that flank while solidifying white's own structure for the upcoming middle game skirmishes. Unleashing a forcing sequence, black decisively seizes the open file, aiming to disrupt white's fragile pawn structure and create immediate threats against the king's defenses. Securing the monarch under the rook's watchful gaze, this subtle retreat anticipates the impending storm of black's pieces now actively penetrating white's position. The black queen elegantly repositions to f6, not only defending the pawn on f4 but also preparing to join the central battle, hinting at a potential re-engagement on the kingside or even a swift sortie towards white's potentially exposed monarch. Shifting the queen to target the weakened kingside pawns offers an immediate tactical threat and aims to disrupt black's developing coordination. Pushing the g-pawn here, 28, g5, undeniably stirs up the dust around white's king, creating a fascinating, albeit risky, dynamic. The intent is clear: to rip open lines for black's pieces and potentially expose the monarch to a dangerous assault. However, this advance also weakens the pawn structure on the kingside considerably, opening up potential avenues for counterplay for white's pieces if black isn't careful with follow-through. The tension this creates is palpable, forcing white to consider immediate defensive measures or risk being overwhelmed by black's newly awakened attacking potential. It's a bold gambit that prioritizes immediate initiative over solid positional structure. Shifting the rook to g3 immediately confronts the exposed black king, threatening to exploit the weakened g-file and potentially open lines for the queen and remaining rook to penetrate. Securing the monarch behind a shield of pawns becomes paramount after that exchange of pieces, as the open files now present significant dangers. A brilliant check from the queen forces the black king into a more exposed position, disrupting any defensive cohesion black might have hoped to build. Now that the opponent's queen has been so forcefully ejected, black's immediate priority must be to solidify the king's defenses, as the open central files present a perilous pathway for white's pieces. A desperate attempt to break free from the suffocating pressure on the kingside, this queen sacrifice aims to open lines of attack against the black king, but it overlooks the superior coordination black now possesses, leaving white's monarch precariously exposed. The queen's departure from the board signals a significant shift, ushering in an endgame where the pawn structure's weaknesses become more pronounced. The knight's sudden appearance on g6 injects immediate chaos, a sharp tactical thrust aimed directly at the exposed black king. This isn't about pawn structure or quiet maneuvering. It's about exploiting a momentary lapse in defensive coverage to create a mating net. Observe how the white queen and knight now coordinate, creating threats that black's remaining pieces struggle to parry effectively. The king's sanctuary is breached, and the entire defensive setup begins to crumble under this aggressive assault. The king's precarious position on f7, now exposed to the gnawing pressure of the knight on g6, feels like being trapped in a corner with the wolves at the door. Suddenly, the knight's migration to *e5* unleashes a forced sequence, disrupting black's hard-won pawn structure and exposing their king to unwelcome scrutiny. This isn't just about capturing a piece. It's about geometrically isolating the black king, which has been enjoying a semblance of safety behind its pawn wall. Notice how the white queen and knight, now coordinating with chilling precision, create unavoidable threats. The king's escape routes are rapidly vanishing, forcing immediate and potentially desperate defensive measures. This tactical geometry is pivotal. The king, now exposed on the dark squares after the queen exchange, needs immediate sanctuary, and repositioning it to a safer file is the paramount concern, preventing further harassment from the knight and potential discovery attacks.